You are now watching Surveillance. Donate or subscribe for more sick twists.
Hey guys, what's going on? So, been a really busy couple weeks for me. I've been having a lot of fun getting 100 parses in pre-patch and old content that nobody cares about. I've been playing with my new VR headset. I've been just spending time with my family and working and all kinds of stuff. It's just been really busy, but I finally have the part 2 video for my one button macro rotation video. We're going to go over some of the criticisms people had for my first video. We're going to go over some questions people had for me. We're going to go over some extra reasons I think you might not want to use the macro, and at the end, if you still decide that you want to use the macro, I will give you some good macros that you can use in different situations that are more tailored to getting as close as possible to that optimal DPS. So let's get started. Okay, so the first criticism is that the sim is not using Divine Plea, which I can assure you it actually is. What I think happened here is that this was recently added to the sim, and people that were talking about it not using Divine Plea probably haven't seen the new update yet, but I assure you it does use Divine Plea, and despite Divine Plea, it has mana issues. So we have right here, we have the Holy Wrath glyph, we have the macro set up. We're gonna go ahead and sim, and we get about 6k. Now if you go to detailed results, first of all, if we take a look at the mana, okay, by the end of the fight we're hitting 20% mana, okay? So Holy Wrath costs a lot of mana. It's 20% of your base mana. It's just about one of the only ways you can go is if you use Holy Wrath too much, which is one of the reasons why I recommend against using the Glyph of Holy Wrath. It doesn't give you the most DPS anyway, but it costs so much mana to use Holy Wrath every 15 seconds or so. I guess it's more about 18 or 20, but it's still a lot. So you go to detailed results and you go to cast, you can see it is using Divine Plea on average twice per fight. And this is a 3-minute fight. Now if you extend that duration out to 4 or 5 minutes, what you're going to see is you're going to see the macro going and this is only because of Holy Wrath. And once again, it is using Divine Plea, so this is one of the only ways you could go in Wrath as a Ret is by using Holy Wrath too much with the glyph. So in my original video, what was most likely happening was the macro was going because it wasn't using Divine Plea. Now it is using Divine Plea, and it's almost going but not quite on 3 minutes. If you go out to 4 or 5 minutes, it will go So I'm just going to go ahead and resim it for you, just so you can see the new data. I'll admit this is probably my mistake for not seeing that the macro was going in my first video, but now that it does use Divine Plea, let's just go ahead and resim everything. So this is phase 1 gear, by the way. This is like one of the highest prios for phase 1 gear. No execute. We have about 6350 DPS. Go to cast sequence, change our glyph from exorcism to Holy Wrath, and what we end up with is about a 350 DPS loss, a little over 5%. Now that doesn't seem too bad at first. Okay, so before we go to execute, something I wanted to show you guys is that if you come here onto the sim and you increase the duration to 5 minutes, which is not unreasonable, there's plenty of fights out there that are going to be 5 minutes or longer. So can the macro survive 5 minutes with the Holy Wrath glyph, spamming Holy Wrath every 12 spells or so? Can the macro survive and not go 5 minutes? The 5800 DPS, that seems about pretty similar, not too far down. So let's see. Remember the timeline. 2% mana at the end, so it goes right at the end. So as you can imagine, if the fight goes any longer than 5 minutes, you're just going to have no mana to play with. You're probably not going to be able to consecrate. And as you can see, it is using Divine Plea. We have 4 casts on this fight. 4 casts, and we're still going That's all in the Holy Wrath. It's all because of the Holy Wrath. Now, Holy Wrath isn't normally an issue, mana-wise, because you're only casting it every 40 seconds or so, because you don't have the glyph. If you do have the glyph and you're using the macro, you're using it a lot more, so Alright, let's take a look at execute. So here I have the Carriac cast sequence. Let's go ahead and sim. Get about 70-20 DPS. This is 40 seconds, by the way. Let's go to custom and change our glyph to a consecrate. So it's about a 10% DPS loss on execute. Now this is really where it suffers the most. And this tends to be because execute phase is a little bit more dynamic. So basically what's going on here is that when you go to cast sequence, you can see that there's 6 spells here, and the Hammer of Wrath cooldown is 6 seconds. So 6 spells at 1.5 seconds per cast is 9 seconds, so you're only casting 1 Hammer of Wrath every 9 seconds. This is why the macro really suffers with execute phase the most, and you can't really remove spells because otherwise your Divine Storm's going to hang. I mean, you can do that, but then you're going to be stuck on Divine Storm, and you're going to be stuck a little bit on Judge here and there. So the reason that this has 6 spells is because you need to fill out those GCDs. So that's why the execute macro really struggles compared to the regular phase macro. So I guess this one is a little bit more of a matter of philosophy. I don't think this is true personally. Now in TBC, it's undeniable that the rotation was much harder, especially to play at a high level. If you wanted to get really high parses, it was a much harder rotation. And in TBC, we still had people beating sim DPS all the time. The DPS that you see on the left side of the sim is an average of 3,000 iterations, or however many iterations you decide to do. And the thing about that is that it's giving you an average. Yes, the sim is playing perfectly, but it's not hard, in my opinion, to play perfectly in Wrath. It is a lot easier than it was in TBC. And playing imperfectly in Wrath, and by that I mean not doing the best possible order for your spells, but still casting your spells as much as you possibly can be, is a lot less punishing. So if you do your spells in the wrong priority, but you're still casting spells as much as you possibly can be, you're still going to be pretty close to optimal most of the time. There is a lot of different prios that are very close to the optimal one. So in my opinion, that's just why nobody's really going to gain much DPS from this unless they're just casting their spells too slowly. And we have a weak aura that's going to tell you what spell to cast next. All you got to do is take your prio, plug it in from the sim into the weak aura, and it's going to tell you exactly what spell to cast next. So it's always going to give you that optimal DPS. Very, very easy to follow. I've been messing around with it myself. Here's a little sample clip of it. So as you can see, it's quite smart. It was adjusting the prio, and other abilities are coming off cooldown. It's adjusting, as you can see. As always, if you want this weak aura, there's a link to it in the description. It's really awesome. You guys will love it. So let's move on. Okay, so if this is your position, then fair enough. That is cool, man. Like, more power to you. Go ahead and use the macro. You won't have to think. You can just press it and you'll do 90% or more of the optimal damage if there's no weird cleave interactions, or if you don't run into any of the issues that I'm going to go into later in the video. Then that's fine. It doesn't bother me if you want to use the macro. I'm just here to tell you the downsides. Okay, so maybe I could have explained this one a little bit better the first time around, so I'm just going to explain it again in detail. Let's start by taking a look at Terryx's video where he's using tier 10 and he's using the macro. So tier 10 2-piece basically resets your Divine Storm cooldown off of your auto attacks, it has like a 40% chance. And the problem with the macro is obviously the macro cannot capitalize on these procs. It doesn't have the ability to cast Divine Storm right after a proc. So what you end up seeing is Teriak having Divine Storm ready to go and not being able to cast it for 5, 6, 7 seconds because he's stuck waiting for the macro to go all the way around till it gets to Divine Storm again. Now if somebody could explain to me how exactly this is optimized for tier 10, because I don't really see it. It doesn't really take a genius or a sim to understand that this is a pretty big problem for the macro. Now for some reason Teriak decided to delete this video, or at least unlist it along with all of his like meme videos. I'm not really sure why that happened, but I fortunately already had a copy. Now I think what people mean by designed for tier 10 or designed for endgame when they're talking about this macro is that compared to other macros people might use, Divine Storm is placed in a position so that it has less downtime, but as you can see from the example clip, this is still a problem. Maybe it handles this set bonus a little bit better than some other macros out there, but it still has the same issue when it comes to adapting to the proc. Now on the sim, I'm getting about 7 or 8% DPS loss with 2-piece tier 10 in phase 4 gear set preset. It's a little bit early to be talking about phase 4 and 5, so I'm sure we'll come back around to this when I do my phase 4 BIS video and give you any updated data that we have at that time. Okay, well, I guess to this point I would just say, if you don't think it's a lot, let me highlight some of the things that give 5 to 10% damage. If you play a Fury Warrior or a Rogue in TBC, completing your glaive set is about a 7 or 8% damage boost. If you play a Hunter in TBC and you upgrade your Golden Bow to a Thoradol, that's about a 4 or 5% damage gain. And early sim data puts Shadowmourne at about a 6 or 7% damage gain over Oathbinder. Now this is early data and it doesn't include the use of a /cancel aura macro, so this number may go up in the future and is subject to change. 5 to 10% damage is a lot of damage in the grand scheme of WoW upgrades. That is on par with most legendary weapons, so surely if you're okay with using a macro and hand waving away all that DPS, then by that logic you would be willing to pass on your legendary weapon upgrades. And you know, if you just don't care about min-maxing and you don't care about doing a lot of damage or parsing, that's totally fine. Use the macro. At the end of the day, just do whatever's going to make you have most fun playing this game, because that's what it's all about. For people like me, having fun playing this game means doing the most possible damage, but I totally respect and understand that that is not the case for everybody. Now this is true, you can switch to manually doing your rotation anytime your macro encounters issues. The problem is that every time you swap between the macro and manual use, you might as well stay at manual FCFS. Every time you go back to using the macro after switching to FCFS, you're going to lose more damage, and this is because your cooldowns are not going to line up properly. If you stop using the macro, then you really should not go back to the macro, because your cooldowns just will not line up properly. Okay, so this criticism was brought up after I brought up the point that if you want to cleanse twice, or if you want to cast any non-DPS abilities, anything besides the macro, you risk having your macro reset. They said, well, you can just change the reset timer to something longer. But the problem is that you have these counteracting forces here, where if you set the reset timer longer, then any time that you need to reset the macro, when there's downtime on a fight, etc., it's going to take a really long time for your macro to actually reset. And of course, the longer it takes, the more damage you've lost. If you set the reset timer shorter, then you run the risk of resetting the macro anytime you cast 2 dispels. And you really can't set it any shorter than 2 seconds because one GCD is only 1.5 seconds long. Anytime you get to a spell that you can't cast with the macro, for whatever reason, you either have to wait until you can cast that spell, or you have to let your macro reset. And if that happens, then your cooldowns aren't going to line up and you're going to have some downtime without any spells. Well, you're right, I've never played Wrath before. However, during the pre-patch so far, I've already been racking up some 99s. Before Classic TBC came out, I had never played Ret before in TBC either. But even so, you guys trusted me to stick to the math, give you guys the scoop, and make any corrections anytime I was wrong. And generally, I would say I did a pretty good job when it comes to TBC. When it comes to my content, I am doing the very best job that I can to make sure that everything I give you guys is 100% accurate and just sticking to the math. Every day in Light Club, we are doing new theory crafting, figuring this out one day at a time. I've got a big team of smart people with me who have played Wrath and are helping me to figure this all out. Honestly, I really didn't think it mattered. Now, Teriak came out with a new macro tutorial, and in this video, he is, instead of giving out one button macro, he is giving out two one button macros because they get stuck on exorcism, and after it gets stuck on exorcism, he switches to a different macro and continues by using that macro instead. Now, I'm not actually sure if this is related to the Art of War hardcast exorcism problem, so let's just recap that real quick. So the standard issue with exorcism is that when you cast exorcism, you need to have an Art of War proc, and if you don't, it's going to take some time to cast. It's going to be an actual spell cast. Now, anytime you cast a spell in WoW, it ends up resetting your swing timer, and this is going to lose you a little bit of damage. So this is something that can happen when you get to the exorcism part of the macro and you don't have an Art of War proc. Now, this is not very common and it gets more rare as you get gear, but it does happen, and I've talked to a few people who have been trying out the macro during pre-patch and they've had it happen to them. Now, I'm unsure if this is exactly why Teriak's macro is getting stuck on exorcism. He mentioned it has to do with movement and moving around a lot while you're using the macro. It could be that he wanted to hardcast exorcism because he didn't have an Art of War proc, and it didn't cast because he was moving, and this is why it got stuck on exorcism, causing him to have to switch to his second macro. Okay, so now we are at the point where we need 3 macros instead of 1. Is that really that much easier than just playing normally? So at this point we have 2 macros for regular phase, 1 regular macro, and then a second macro for when exorcism gets stuck. Then we have a 3rd macro for execute. But wait, there's more. We actually need a cleave macro as well, because on cleave you're going to want to order your spells differently to make sure that you get your consecrate out real quick, right at the start of the pull. You're going to need another macro for when you're and you can't cast consecrate or holy wrath. You're going to need another macro for 4-piece tier 7, where you can reorder your spells and get a lot more DPS out of a different macro. So this is kind of why I say there's no real singular macro. I mean, you can use one macro for the entire game. If that's what you want to do, then go for it. But if you want to use the best one because it's closest to optimal, then you're going to need a lot more macros. And if that's something you're interested, I would recommend going onto the sim and crafting your own macro for your own given gear and situation. I know I touched on this a little bit before, but the macro has a lot of issues when it comes to cleave. First and foremost is the fact that being able to time your Divine Storm and your Consecrate is a big part of doing a lot of damage on cleave. And if you give up the agency of when you want to cast those spells, you can end up sacrificing a lot of DPS because of it, especially on trash. Now, if you guys have been playing pre-patch like I have, then you'll know that on trash, timing your abilities is actually so key. Getting that consecrate out early, getting that divine storm out early is so big when it comes to getting trash damage. A lot of times I found myself holding my divine storm and casting other spells instead while I was waiting for mobs to come closer to me so I could divine storm them when they got there. Now, I touched on this one earlier, so I'll keep it brief, but we run into problems with movement. If you're using the macro and you have downtime, you have to move around, you're going to have to keep spamming the macro or it's going to reset. If you let it reset, then your cooldowns are going to be off. You're going to have some downtime where you can't cast any spells, and then you run into all kinds of other issues with cleave or timing your abilities. If you have to move, you have no ability to time your judgment or your exorcism while you're out of range and making use of that time, or timing your melee abilities when you're in range, or even timing your consecrate so there's somebody there to actually step in it. So you heard me mention this one earlier. The macro does use a lot more mana than FCFS, and it goes in about 3 to 5 minutes depending on the situation. Basically, that's as long as you can go, up to 5 minutes before you're totally and that's including divine plea every minute, 1 dark rune, and an arcane torrent. Okay, so basically to summarize, I have all the reasons you might not want to use it listed here, all the pros and cons that I could come up with. This should be everything I talked about in the last 2 videos, and if you guys want to check this out, this document will be listed down in the description. This is our Ret Deep Dive Guide document created by me and Aaron. We talked about this in a recent episode of the deep dives on Crix and Sarth's channel. If you guys want to check that out, that'll be in the description as well. I just uploaded that yesterday. So yeah, if you guys want to pour through all the different reasons, you can come down to this document. I'll have them all listed here. And but honestly, if you're thinking about using it, I would just start using it in game and tell me what you think. I honestly don't think you're gonna like it, but if you do, then more power to you. Oh, and make sure you come down here to the bottom and check out the weak ores and add-ons we have recommended for you. Highly recommend those. And if you want to hear more about those, we talked about them in the deep dive on my channel. Okay, so as promised, I have a couple extra macros for you guys. You can find these in the document down in the description, the Ret Deep Dive Guide. Come down here to the bottom of the document and come to the 1-button rotation macro section. I have a couple macros listed here for you. The top one is Teriax. Okay, the second one is a macro that I found that generally performs better than Teriax. It doesn't require the Holy Wrath glyph, so it doesn't even use Holy Wrath, which means that it's a lot better on mana. If you're going to use a macro in pre-patch or phase 1, which again I don't recommend, but if you're going to use one, I definitely recommend going with this second macro here. And then we have a third macro. This one is for 4-piece tier 7, so this is phase 1 Bis. If you're going to use a macro at this point, you should be using this macro here. There's a lot of different macros that with very specialized circumstances can get pretty close to optimal. For example, having the set bonus lets you fit in Judgment of Wisdom more in your macro, so this like actually unlocks like a lot more DPS. This macro here will get within 200 DPS of Bis in phase 1 with the 4-piece bonus, which reduces your judge cooldown by 1 second, and it also requires having the consecration glyph, which makes consecration do 2 extra ticks and last 2 extra seconds, but has a longer cooldown. So it's just it just goes for longer basically. So 200 DPS under those conditions, it'll be better than Teriax macro in most situations that I've found, but it is pretty similar, but there are some swaps here that you can see, you can look through. And then down here we have an execute macro. This execute, there's not really good execute macros most of the time, but one thing that you can do is when you get 4-piece tier 7, this unlocks like a better execute macro, which I have listed down here. It's the second one. This allows you to fit in 2 Judgments of Wisdom into the macro, and it kind of like helps you get It helps you get more DPS out of an execute macro that you wouldn't normally otherwise be able to get. It's only because of the Judgment of Wisdom reduced cooldown. This one can actually get within 50 DPS of optimal, so a lot closer. You know, if none of the issues that we have listed down here happen to you or apply to you, then it can get pretty close. So if you want to use a macro, I have some better ones for you, and I recommend that you use these instead. If you do end up using them, let me know what you think. But once again, I recommend just not using them in general. So that'll be all for this video today, guys. If you want to support the channel, you can like, subscribe, comment, whatever you want. Support me on Patreon if you got extra money to throw around. If not, all good. I do it for the love of the community. And check out my next video coming out soon on Phase 1 BIS and pre-raid BIS for Ret Paladins. See you next time, guys. Have a good day, and stick with the light.
This show was brought to you by Light Club, where monkeys go to church.